Very special thanks once again to Philip Raby Specialist Cars. Of course, I've worked with them before on the channel for a number of different very interesting vehicles, from Mercedes AMGs, even of course to other Porsches, and that is their main speciality: Porsche servicing and Porsche sales. You can find a wide variety of new and older Porsches, such as the ones that I've reviewed in the past, and even this one. So if you are in the market for one, or if you already own one and you're looking to get some servicing done at a professional level, then of course click the link down below and check out their website. The Porsche Panamera is a car which I've wanted to review actually for quite a long time, and it's a vehicle which has had a very interesting arc for me personally in terms of how much I like or don't like it. See, when the Panamera first came out, I was not a fan of this at all, and I will freely admit that most of that was because of its appearance. See, Porsches have this interesting design philosophy, as many manufacturers have, wherein they apply a similar shape and a similar look to multiple vehicles. And that's nothing new. Of course, most manufacturers do that. In some cases, though, I think it works better than others. And to me, the idea of essentially like a stretched 911 with 4 doors kind of sounds better on paper than it looks in practice. And in particular, it was the back end of this first Panamera that I wasn't a huge fan of. To me, it looked like it wanted to be a wagon desperately, or at least a shooting brake style vehicle, but couldn't quite make it there because it wanted to stay in the sedan category. It's not exactly a usual sedan shape, let's at least concede that point. And in terms of appearance, I don't know many people who would argue that the Panamera is more pretty, for instance, than something like an Aston Martin Rapide in that same category, or even my own car from the past, the Maserati Quattroporte, which is pretty much universally accepted as being one of the best looking 4-door cars ever built. But here's the thing. There was another car that I drove earlier this year which I fell in love with immediately. In fact, this other vehicle is my favourite car that I've driven all year so far, and it's a car that I wasn't expecting. And that, to me, is the key point that it shares in common with this Porsche. The car that I'm referring to is the Jaguar XFR. I like Jaguar in a similar way to how I like Porsche. I wouldn't have said that it was a top 10 brand for me, but I have a lot of respect for them. I like a number of their cars. I just don't have that personal allegiance to them as a marque. However, as soon as I sat behind the wheel and started driving the XFR, when I saw what the interior looked like and felt like, the space, the comfort, the build quality, then when I started the engine and heard the sound it makes, then when I experienced the comfort of the suspension, the ride quality, the handling, and of course the performance, it just made me love it more and more. And I said as much in my review for that car. The Panamera is exactly the same in that regard, because from the outside, you can talk back and forth all day long in terms of whether or not it's a good or not so good design from Porsche's point of view. What is, in my opinion, unarguable is that the Panamera took what the Cayenne started, that spark of genius, which has ultimately made Porsche the, you could say, dominant force that they are now, compared to traditionally more of a pure sports car company, now with big SUVs, small ones, sedans, wagons, and sports cars as well. Except, unlike the Cayenne, which for a while I was actually considering getting myself, I was actually going to trade in my Touareg for a Cayenne. They're built, of course, on the same production line, or at least they were back then, but then there were a couple of things that just put me off. The lack of a diesel in the Cayenne back then made the fuel economy pretty bad, and it just, to me, felt less robust than the Touareg does. It felt like more of a parts bin special, to be honest, and that was not what I wanted or expected from a Porsche. Now that was understandable, even justifiable at the time, because they'd never done anything like that before on a production scale. What makes the Panamera so good, not just this GTS, but I would argue pretty much any of them, because this is the first generation Panamera, the 970 shape, is that they learn so quickly from their mistakes, if you even want to call them that, and Porsche has this strong track record of taking any kind of thing which could even be considered remotely a mistake and immediately fixing it and making the next vehicle that much better. I think that's what makes them so strong. The Panamera fixes all of the issues that I had with the Cayenne. It still offers the practical, the daily driver, the spacious, the even economical side of things that you would have wanted from that Cayenne at the time, but which the Cayenne way back in that first generation didn't have. This does come with a diesel, and spoiler alert, as awesome as this GTS is, and of course I'll talk performance in a second, if I were to buy a Panamera, I would honestly buy the diesel. And I know that sounds sacrilegious, but the diesel is a phenomenal car. It has an Audi-sourced engine, about 250 horsepower, it can do over 150 miles an hour, 0 to 60, about 6.8 seconds, still has all-wheel drive, but it can do close to 50 miles per gallon. Plus, it's significantly cheaper for a used one than a GTS would be for understandable reasons. You've got the same gorgeous interior, it turns heads everywhere you drive because it just has that kind of road presence which you would want from a Porsche. It's big, it's wide, it's low, it's sleek, much like something like a Rapide or a Quattroporte, except it has that distinctly German slant of being over-engineered in the best ways. Now, of course, I'm not going to go ahead and claim that a Porsche Panamera will never break down or something crazy like that, but I would bet good money that it would probably break down a lot less often than my Maserati did, and probably less than an Aston Martin Rapide would as well, as gorgeous as that car is. Now, in terms of this specific model, because of course, just like the strong point that I mentioned about the 911, in terms of having so many options to choose from to appeal to different kinds of driver, the Panamera does the same thing, and that's why it's so great to me. For someone like me who loves to have a stunning looking daily driver with the badge panache but also the great fuel economy, you've got the diesel. For somebody who's just looking for over the top crazy performance but still in a 4-door 4-seater with great trunk space, you've got all the way up to the Turbo S. For somebody who wants a more pure, almost 4-door 911 experience, you've got this one, the GTS. And the key difference is, although it's not as quick as the turbo or as economical as the diesel, it's a naturally aspirated V8. So in effect, it delivers what you could kind of want from that first or even second generation Cayenne S, but without the oversized body and the excess weight. So for instance, in the case of this car, it is naturally aspirated, as I said, no turbos here, 4.8 litre V8, sounds stunning, as you heard at the start of the video in particular, and the really impressive thing about it, and I'm so glad that this is carried over from the 911, something which I've said in both of my 911 reviews, and this is also held in common with a couple of other manufacturers as well, notably Mazda with their rotary engines such as the RX-7, and certainly TVR as well, with cars like the Tuscan and the Chimera. The performance from power ratio that Porsche can achieve is remarkably good, because this car has 424 horsepower. That sounds good. It doesn't sound amazing though. That sounds pretty much like what you'd expect from something like an Audi RS4. It also puts out 384 pound-feet of torque, which again is pretty good but not necessarily remarkable. And of course a lot of that is due to it being naturally aspirated. But then when you actually feel that performance, it feels a whole lot more powerful than 424, I can tell you that. And there are a couple of pretty legitimate and obvious reasons for that. Unlike a lot of its rivals, it's all-wheel drive, and that is a huge advantage. Now, having something like an all-wheel drive Maserati Quattroporte from the era that I had wouldn't really make that much sense. It would just be another thing to break. In the case of an Aston Martin, well, of course it wouldn't be all-wheel drive because that wasn't the point of the car. And even something like a Mercedes AMG, would you really want all-wheel drive on something that rampant in terms of torque and wheel spin? It would probably neuter a lot of its charm, especially in the late 90s and 2000s generation cars in particular. This one though, well, of course it makes sense. Porsche has an established history with all-wheel drive, even on their sports cars, and it's carried over perfectly. Especially somewhere like England, because we don't have perfect roads. We have inclement weather a lot of the time, and all-wheel drive makes that unnoticeable. You can just put all of that power and torque down and almost never need to worry about the car stepping out. I remember one distinct occasion where I was driving my Maserati back last year through a car park, and I just pulled it out of the parking space that I was in, and I must have given it maybe a little bit too much throttle, and suddenly the back end stepped out. The car full-on drifted in a car park, and as badass as that sounds, It's not badass when you weren't trying to. And on a British road in wet weather, that's the last thing you want to happen in a 4-door, 20-foot long, 2-ton limo. It sounds fun, but this is real life. You can't respawn like in Forza or Gran Turismo. You will smash up your very nice car. Having all-wheel drive makes that much of a difference. And of course it's about more than all-wheel drive. It's the PDK gearbox as well, which is fantastic in the case of this car. It shifts through the gears in a perfect way in terms of around town docile driving compared to flat-out performance. And to go back to that performance for a second, this does not feel anything close to a 424 horsepower car. If I didn't know that that was the power output, I would easily guess that this had over 500. That's how powerful it feels. Because, for instance, that Jaguar that I love so much had 503 horses, and yet it's still, on paper, slower than this to 60. And part of that is because of the lack of all-wheel drive. Another thing that I love about Porsche is that they couldn't care less about the gentleman's speed agreement when it comes to restricting top-end performance. This is a flat-out 180 mile an hour car, and I love that. I've never seen the point in restricting cars to 155. What is the point of having that much power and prestige and performance if you're just going to neuter it immediately? I love the fact that they allowed this to really do what it's capable of. And even with all of that performance considered, 4.5 seconds to 60, which is very good for a car of its type, certainly of its power, with the top speed of 180 miles an hour, and the weight, I mean it's close to a 2-ton car, it can still return a combined economy of about 26 miles per gallon, and that's UK miles per gallon as well. That's not bad at all. In fact, once again, that can handily outpace a lot of the competition. In fact, on paper, this is quicker than a Quattroporte. It's quicker than a Rapide, it's quicker than an XFR, an M5, and a lot of AMGs as well, certainly of the time, and even some which are newer. And to go back to the practicality again for just a second, it's not just stuff like fuel economy and all-wheel drive that makes it so good as a daily driver, it's the interior as well. It looks stunning. There is tons of space inside. One of the slight detractors that I've always had about the 911 is that I don't fit in them all that well. The 997 was pretty good, the 993 not so much. It was a little cramped for me. That's not a problem in a Panamera, and of course it wouldn't be in something like a Cayenne, but that's a massive car. The Panamera is much lower and much sleeker, but in a similar way to the Jag XK, the GT Coupe, which is also a great car in that regard, this has endless legroom. In fact, you can put the seat so far back that even me, as a 6'3" driver, needs to put the seat forward a little bit to really get that optimum seating. The rear space as well is fantastic. Yes, it's technically only got the same amount of seats as a 911 Carrera anyway, a 2+2, but the reality is those extra 2 doors and the extra legroom, it makes a massive difference. I mean, a 2+2 is technically a 4-seater, but only for kids in the back really. This is a proper car for 4 full-sized adults. The trunk space, as I already said, is fantastic as well, and you could see that at the start of the video. It's just the kind of car that you really can genuinely use every day. Overall, my thoughts on the Panamera, regardless, to be honest, of the GTS, all the way up to the Turbo, or the Turbo S, all the way down, you could say, to something like the Hybrid or even the Diesel, which, as I said, would be my car of choice. These are remarkably good super saloons, and as soon as you drive one, regardless of if you like the Panamera, regardless of if you even like Porsche, unless you're just blindly biased, you can't really say anything but that they are very impressive cars. The Panamera is quite comfortably my favourite Porsche, in fact, and I would include even some of their 911s and even something like the Carrera GT in that regard, because to me, something that has all of that performance but also great value, great space, practicality, something that you can genuinely use every day, it makes all the difference to me. I mean, anyone who doubted that would only need to look at my choice of dream car, the Ferrari FF. It's pretty much the pinnacle of usable daily extreme performance. Likewise, the Panamera, in a much more affordable way, funnily enough, offers that same kind of package. Now, the only slight detractor that I will say as far as this car goes is the rear visibility, in particular with the central rear view mirror looking out of the rear window, is not ideal. And the main reason for that is due to the shape of the back end. But apart from that, there's really nothing else about the car that I didn't like. I like the look from most of the angles apart from the back. The trunk space is fantastic, the interior space is great, I love the interior design. One of the most surprising things to me was actually the lack of buttons on the steering wheel. It was refreshingly old school, in fact, and instead, of course, they have that gorgeous center console with all of the buttons located there instead. Ultimately, I have to applaud Porsche for what they did with this Panamera because unlike the Cayenne, this is a vehicle where they basically just got everything right the first time around. And apart from the design, there's not much about that statement that you can argue with. It's, in my opinion, a significant improvement from a first-generation vehicle than the Cayenne was for its time, and in terms of being a true, authentic, quote-unquote Porsche, I think it carries over one of the most important things about the 911 in terms of it being so versatile. It really does go from everything between a 45 mile per gallon genuine diesel sedan all the way up to a 550 horsepower monster of a super saloon, and everything in between. Ultimately, I would encapsulate my thoughts on the Panamera not just on its own, but even in comparison to the other vehicles that I've reviewed here on the channel, many of which of course you can check out in the Beards and Cars playlist. I would sum it up this way. The Jaguar XFR is a car that will win your heart. The Panamera is a car that will win your mind. That's the biggest difference between the two. So it really depends on what kind of enthusiast you are. Do you prefer a car that's more overtly passionate and charismatic? Or do you prefer a car that, yes, does have that as well, but also has even more of a focus on the engineering side of things? A very overtly, but for all the best reasons, German exotic. Either way, that choice is up to you, but I can say that whichever Panamera you choose, you'll probably like it quite a bit because there is plenty to love about the car. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the Panamera GTS. I would actually love to drive the Panamera diesel at some point on the channel as well, but we'll have to see about that, of course. Until then, check out the other car reviews that I've already done on the channel, including perhaps that Jaguar XFR, which I've referenced a number of times, and until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.